Hello and welcome to the global series on hydrogen, where we slice through the buzz to see how the rhetoric of green hydrogen especially can be turned into reality. Very glad to have Andrew Bedford, the Director of Energy and Resource Transition at KBR, based in Singapore, here with us today. Hi, Andrew.
Hello, Michelle, and nice to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's start with some broad strokes. Money is usually a good area to start with. The Hydrogen Council has said that building the hydrogen economy will require approximately $280 billion in investment by 2030, which is a very short 9 years away, especially against the economic backdrop we're experiencing at the moment. The IMF said last year that the global economy was in the worst state it's been in since the Great Depression of the 1930s, although of course the outlook is certainly looking better this year with the rollout of vaccines and other measures that have been taken. And we've also seen the IEA saying that as part of this Build Back Better, to get the energy transition on track for the next 3 years, $1 trillion to be spent per year to kickstart the momentum. With all these very large numbers flying around at a time when a lot of companies and governments are a little unsteady on their feet, how does that play out for hydrogen and getting the investments that are needed into the market for pilot projects and for R&D, and then of course to ramp up the scale to make this 2030 goal of an established market a reality?
Yeah, it is a big challenge, and we are seeing a huge amount of interest in hydrogen generally, in decarbonisation. I mean, it's driving a lot of the work we're doing as KBR, especially the advisory and consulting group. We're often at the front end of these projects, so the concept, feasibility, and looking at the financing of these projects. And it is challenging. I mean, the pure green projects, they need a lot of support to get off the ground. There has to be government support, subsidies or incentives, or the other way around to make it happen is to put a price on carbon. So I think most people
both are very, very tricky conversations.
Yeah, very much so. But I think most people are coming to the realization that you need a price on carbon now. That's what's got to happen, and the costs for the emissions associated with whatever product or energy supply chain or pathway that you use and develop, that has to be considered and somehow paid for. That will help get these projects off the ground. Everybody has this vision to get to the green, pure decarbonized energy supplies, but I think there's a middle ground where carbon capture has to be used. The scale of the demand for energy is so large that each of these small pilot projects for pure green hydrogen, they're only just scratching the surface. I mean, they're great for the headlines. They get a lot of interest, and that's ultimately where we'll get to. But the pathway to get there has to be done in stages. And a lot of the modeling work our team has done around the economic models and the supply chains and comparing the different carriers for hydrogen in particular, and also the CCS technologies, it implies that there's a blue hydrogen pathway that's not quite half of the cost of green, but it's certainly more economic, and the projects are much more likely to get off the ground, especially where there's a price on carbon. So Europe in particular, probably the US, especially with the change in administration now. But yeah, there's certain hotspots, on Earth. We're seeing a lot of activity in APAC in particular. So Japan and Korea, I think, are driving a lot of that interest in hydrogen generally, but also use of ammonia as a carrier, and using that for combustion in power or the bunker fuel space, which seems to be gaining traction right now.
And we saw the world's first export of that from Saudi Arabia to Japan last year, second half of last year as well.
Yeah, I think that may have been a bit of marketing, but it's a nice achievement.
As you just mentioned as well about those headlines, and those headlines are, and that's exactly what this session is to do, is to cut through those, and as you've already touched on it, actually get to the nitty-gritty of these, and the same with those figures that I threw out at the beginning. These are headline grabbing figures, but what do they actually mean? Just something to pull out from what you mentioned on the carbon price and the need for a carbon price market. Of course, we have the EU ETS, and we've got some others that have been popped up, and nothing as established as that yet, and that itself has also had big problems too. Do you see a price on carbon being established in time for the hydrogen market to not end up being subsidized? Because subsidizing it loops us back round to this, which many people feel is just going backwards. We're trying to evolve the energy markets and the energy economics as well. And subsidizing the hydrogen market will just drag us backwards and create more inefficiencies for later on, even if it does help us now. Do you think that a carbon price can be established in time? Because again, it's another long-running conversation.
Yeah, I think it is, and that's the trend, that's the direction of travel. So I think most people have accepted, including the energy companies themselves, that there has to be and there will be a price on carbon. You know, I've done financial modeling for various projects, and those clients will ask us to include, you know, X dollars per ton of CO2 within those, you know, operating models and in those financial models. So they factor in.
Would they not ask you to, sorry to interrupt, would they not ask you to do that, say, 5 years ago? Because from my perspective, this price on carbon conversation and companies saying that they do need to look at it and so on, that's been going on for years, well over 10 years. But you're saying that when it actually comes to the nitty-gritty in those meeting rooms, they are now asking you to put that in the report, whereas 5 years ago, perhaps it was a sideline issue and it wasn't part of the modelling?
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, maybe some people did, some of the majors, but they didn't really take it so seriously. It's more of a nominal figure, just a consideration or a line item. But nowadays, it's, you know, let's use $80 a ton or 100. You know, there's some public numbers out there that we are seeing, and if it's not from the energy companies themselves, who are really the people who need to make the biggest change, but it's also the financial institutions that they're considering their own risks and liabilities in terms of stranded assets and how do they repurpose assets. You know, they've already got investments. Yeah, exactly. So what do they do with those assets or companies they've invested in? Can they repurpose them? Do they need to retire them early? How do they limit their exposure to this? Or yeah, I think repurposing assets is certainly going to be a hot topic over coming years. There's a lot of aging oil and gas stuff, especially in the North Sea. Maybe regions like Gulf of Mexico and in Asia as well. There may be something else they can do with those. And really, I think that the conversation is moving more towards repurposing for carbon capture. And the questions we're commonly asked by financial institutions are, how much does it cost? And how do you do it? What's the timeline? But it's not an easy one to answer either, because every field is different. They've each got their own technical challenges in terms of field development planning, the types of kit and equipment and platforms that already exist and what state they're in. So you have to consider each project in its own right, its own, you know, every aspect individually.
And you're not replacing like for like either, because with the fourth industrial revolution and the rise of digitalization and digitization as well, these new tools need to be integrated into upgrades and new technologies and infrastructure too. So it's not a like for like in terms of a stage in time, it's a point in time with the technology that we have available. The upgrades also include a sophisticated level of digitalization. Yeah. That's another factor, I imagine.
It is for sure. Yeah, there's many people looking at unmanned platforms or demanning or just less people, and also for safety. It's not just cost. But yeah, I mean, there's more talk around carbon capture hubs around APAC in particular, but elsewhere, UK has got 7 or 8 carbon capture hubs planned. So if there's a price on carbon, there may be people bringing in CO2 and treating it more like a commodity that could be traded and, you know, aggregated into, you know, the demand aggregated in certain locations and then shipped out to other carbon capture hubs. We're some years away from that, but I think people, mentally, people are starting to plan those types of facilities. But we're some way off. However, I do see that that's the direction of travel over the coming decade. How do they do the large-scale carbon capture, create the hubs, and maybe bring in CO2 from other locations that don't have the right sort of geological resources to store the CO2?
And in turn, support the evolution of really established and priced hydrogen markets. Yeah,
exactly. And yeah, I mean, green will take a while to get there, but I think there are certain regions of the world which have the best renewable resources, maybe tax breaks or incentives or subsidies. And you're already seeing headlines where there's very low renewable prices of like, 1 cent per kilowatt hour. And if those, I know that they're headlines, so they may not be the real prices, but even if they're close, that's already getting towards very competitive with fossil fuel. That helps, they may become the hotspots, and that helps to create an industry, a new energy economy and supply chain from those areas. And in particular, we're seeing Middle East and India with those sorts of headlines, but let's see how that evolves over coming years as well.
Exactly, the proof is in the pudding, as we touched on. I mean, the Middle East is very much saying it wants to be a global hydrogen exporting economy. It's got its sights set on Europe already, as we chat about with Saudi Arabia's exports over to Japan as well. Again, a very strong marketing move. And just saying there about the risk of stranded assets, and the Financial Times' Lex said that with the climate targets ambition by 2050 with the Paris Agreement, that could be up to $900 billion in risk for stranded assets if steps aren't taken as part of that energy transition. How do you think, and another mention what recently has been about the use of gas infrastructure in Europe to help import hydrogen from other areas and of course across the continent. Do you think that threading that into that risk of stranded assets, do you think that that's something we'll see a lot of in terms of using existing gas infrastructure for hydrogen, for the hydrogen market to grow? Or do you think the demand for gas is still so vast that it will need to be used for gas and LNG?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions there, but in economies in particular, where you have seasons, where there's a winter and a summer, you know, the energy demand in the winter is something like 6 or 7 times the summer energy demand. So gas is really the only practical way right now to satisfy that demand. You store it at scale in, you know, tanks and in the pipelines themselves. So there's a large capacity. So I think gas has to be used. It has to be the interim, despite the issues around, you know, methane's global warming potential. Yeah, it's really the only practical stepping stone. It's cleaner than coal, that's for sure. There's less pollution, and you can produce hydrogen from it with SMR. So our team at 𝗘𝗃𝗄 has been doing more studies around, you know, steam methane reforming and technologies like that, ATR, with CCS bolted on, or methane pyrolysis, where you turn the CO2 into a product. So something like carbon black or graphite. Those technologies have a lot of potential, and there's another potential revenue stream for that graphite, for example. But yes, it does have some way to go. A lot of these technologies are sort of mid-level TRL, technology readiness level. So some of them on the edge of commercialization and need a bit more investment to get them over the line. But I think countries like, you know, those in the Middle East, you said they're interested in these types of projects on hydrogen.
Very publicly, the government leaders very much wanting to put their names on the headlines saying so, which, as we know, for the Middle East is a strong intent.
Yeah, and they're really hedging their bets, and they can use CO2 for re-injection for enhanced oil recovery, and have done for a long time. They could maybe scale that up or produce hydrogen at source and capture the CO2 at source as well. There's various ways you can do it, but in terms of hedging their bets generally, as a nation, you know, whichever country does it, it does make sense. So if there's a new energy supply chain that's decarbonized, they have a share of that market. They're not relying on the old declining market, and reuse the older existing assets. So Europe has made massive statements that they're racing to sort of create that market and grab a share of it. Germany, I think, has stated something like 80% of its hydrogen will be imported after 2030. And they're looking to North Africa and the Middle East in particular to supply a lot of that hydrogen. So yes, you can reuse some of those pipelines that feed into Europe, but I think really the challenge will be creating a traded product on the open seas that's more flexible and free, a bit like LNG is now. Yeah, and people have a more fluid liquid market that gives them more trading options, not just a tied pipeline to Italy or Spain.
Absolutely, because we've seen in the past with more traditional markets that doesn't always pay off geopolitically either, and perhaps don't want to have hands tied again with a newly established market. Just looping over to Asia, we did a round table recently, and speakers from Asia were asked, do you think it's realistic that Asia can be a leading hydrogen economy, world leading hydrogen economy by 2030, considering the current state, and then it's only, of course, 39 years away. 75% of them said yes. Do you firstly think that that is realistic? And secondly, to make that a reality, what would you say that would need to be the next 3 steps broadly?
Yeah, it's very realistic. Most of the projects and the demand we see and the funding is from places like Japan and Korea. So whenever somebody is planning one of these projects, they want to know who the off-taker will be, first of all, to make the project bankable and help underwrite it. And often they are Japanese or Korean. So I think they will make these happen. There's various Japanese companies or Korean companies and trading groups likely to be involved in the shipping, in the production of hydrogen or carrier products like 𝗘𝗏𝘁 or ammonia. We're seeing a lot of interest in. And what we need to see, I think people are learning from the renewables evolution, seeing how the cost declines have happened over time. They know now how it works, and it's been known for a long time how technology, as you increase the volume of technology of a particular piece of equipment, the costs decline. So they're trying to do the same time and accelerate it for electrolyzers in particular, and all the other bits of kit. So it's really the electrolysis that you need to decline and encourage the evolution of for the green hydrogen. But carbon capture, I'd say the costs have been declining quite rapidly recently. We've done detailed analysis, about 30 different technologies. And there are some that claim they can get to sort of less than $30 a ton, maybe $20 a ton of CO2. Even Shell, I think,
that's
in Europe,
low.
That's very low, and it's happened sort of in the last year or two. But there's a lot of movement in the UK. There's a few small companies as well as people like Shell. There's also 𝗙𝗏𝘅𝗏. They've all got quite competitive technologies that I would say, yeah, that they make it viable, especially when in Europe, when you have a carbon price, I think about 30 euros a ton at the moment. Yeah, it's already there. So when you're looking to finance a project or make it bankable, I think these days you would have to show how you are going to tackle CO2. It has to be factored into the design of whatever asset you're developing.
I mean, one of the figures that's come out from the Hydrogen Council recently is that there's a $50 billion funding gap when it comes to making green hydrogen at cost parity with other types of hydrogen by 2028 to 2030, depending on a country's level of development, depending on other infrastructure and so on. So that confidence that these projects are moving on, and that cost of carbon as well, that potential cost of carbon as well, is going to be critical for building confidence to get that funding in hands and get it into projects. Just looking at some work the KBR is doing specifically in Singapore, the Prime Minister's office, which is assessing the potential source of hydrogen imports into the country. What is the status of this project? How does Singapore see the value and volume of hydrogen and its future?
Yeah, there's only so much I can say because the report hasn't been published yet. I think that's later this year. But yeah, it's done a lot of work on it, looked at the various sources of export. So this is all public in the scope of works. So we mapped out as many potential sources of export of hydrogen as we could. Green, as well as looked at other ways of producing it from brown sources or blue sources or domestically or anywhere. Looked at the technologies involved in the production and storage and transport. And then we looked at the four domestic sort of downstream uses. So there was industry, power, city gas, and mobility as well. So we looked in detail at those four sectors to see what Singapore could do. And I think that they are adamant they will meet their decarbonisation targets in Singapore. They cannot risk losing credibility by missing those targets. So everyone has these Paris agreements. I think 196 countries have signed up now. Many of those are trying, desperately looking around for ways to decarbonize through energy efficiency, or decreasing demand, or switching to renewables. And Singapore is in a difficult place. It doesn't have much land area, and there's only so much you can do with renewables. So really, it's left with either green electrons from somewhere else, integrating its power grid. So there is some discussion around the ASEAN power grid of late, but that's been going on for 20, 30 years.
Similar to the Middle East.
Yeah, exactly. So I know it's a complex problem, but if it's a freely traded product, it's a lot easier to handle and move around. So Singapore's role is, its strength is its ports and its trade and its location. So if it can help aggregate demand and or commodities like CO2, even that would put it in a really strong position for the future. And I think that we see Singapore is moving even before we finished the study, and we've been working very closely with various government departments. So yeah, I think they're very efficient and they plan things very well in Singapore. they take a long time to build consensus between all the companies and the groups involved. So yeah, I think they will try very hard to decarbonize the Singaporean industry and power sectors, as well as the city gas and mobility, but they're much smaller energy demand centers than industry and power. That's maybe 70–80% of the demand.
And like you say, that feeds into the broader picture that Asia is very much giving us, that it is determined to hit its targets, and that hydrogen will be a key part of that.
Yeah, so I think the laggard really has been Australia, because they have this huge opportunity. There's there's probably 100 different hydrogen projects of various sizes been announced. I was told there was just 50 in Queensland alone, which is probably increasing. So I was told that.
Wow.
We know there's some very large-scale multi-gigawatt projects, announced in Western Australia and South Australia and other locations, but they all seem to be going a little bit slower than we expected. There's a few pilots underway, and I think really that's down to sort of lack of federal support. There's lots of state support, lots of state interest. There's some companies sort of trailblazing and trying to find a way to make it work, but without that coordinated federal support and a carbon price, it's just not quite getting there. But I think
did we not see a similar start-stop situation with some of the major LNG projects as well with Australia? I mean, I've seen now in terms of export, Australia is near the top, very, very much near the top, back and forth a little bit with Qatar in terms of the lead. But that's different points. There were big question marks over some of the projects and the financings for those to get the export market building. Yeah,
totally agree. And I think a lot of lessons have been learned from those past LNG projects. So now when they create the hydrogen export projects or ammonia export or whatever they want to do to take the hydrogen energy from A to B, they will look at the way they export it, shared facilities perhaps. And I think then there will be hopefully more consideration into the master planning of how you build an export facility. I realize there's always competition between companies to be first mover and off the ground, but I think even those companies realize that they need to work together to make sure it's done in the most efficient way possible and the safest way possible as well.
Of course. Andrew, thank you very much for joining us. I think there's a lot to think about.
No problem. Thank you.